everybody. Welcome to Church History for Chumps. This is John Simon, the head honcho of the show, and I can say that proudly today because, believe it or not, my brother-in-arms, Thomas Duell, is actually not here. On a fateful day, actually just yesterday, he texted me, called me, and said, "John, I'm up to my neck in schoolwork. The work of the Lord needs to be done, and I can't help you today." And so I'll tell you guys what I did. I went to Google and I started typing, and I typed in most beautiful podcast host, and she's here with us today. My one and only wife, my beloved Annie Valencia.
Hello, dear listener.
Yeah.
Hi, here I am. And
Annie, have you ever done a podcast before?
No, this is my first time. I have, with friends, been like, oh, we should do a podcast about this. We should do a podcast about that. Never actually did any planning or meetings.
Yeah.
This is the first.
But here's the thing, sweetie. You're a long-time listener, first-time caller, because you've faithfully listened to a lot of our episodes.
Yeah.
Which I think is really great. So I've actually prepared a little mini game to get everyone kind of primed, and I love doing a little game show kind of thing. So we're gonna call this "How Well Do You Know Your Husband's Podcast?"
Oh no!
All right, how well do you know your husband's podcast? And we have our guest here, Miss Valencia. So Annie, what was the first topic that Church History for Chumps ever covered? What was our first episode on?
Oh my gosh. There were so many. And
there's only one first episode.
No. There were so many different episodes is what I mean. And your heresies was season 2. Mm-hmm. Hang on. My wheels are turning.
That's okay. I put you very on the spot, sweetie.
Can you give me a hint?
It's getting hot.
So somebody who was burned at the stake?
I realize that's kind of misleading. Okay, hot climate-wise.
Okay, no, he was the founder of the Desert Fathers.
Desert Fathers, you got it,
yeah.
See? All right.
No, it wasn't just one guy, it was just the Desert Fathers.
It was the Desert Fathers, that's right. All right,
okay.
That's good. Okay, all right, so the next question I won't ask about the podcast at all, but I figure this would be a good question to help our listeners get to know you a little bit better, and this is two things I know that you really care about.
Okay.
So, if this podcast was not about what we're going to be talking about, but it was a deep dive into the faith themes of blank movie, and it could be the faith themes of an amazing movie that you love or the faith themes of a faith movie that you don't like, what would it be? And we're doing it like right now. So like no time for prep. We just got to jump in.
Okay, I think I would go let's look into the faith themes into a wonderful, great, complex movie rather than just like a bad Christian movie, because in my experience, their lack of complexity is part of the problem. So there's not really much to talk about other than, like the theology and the theory of what makes people make movies like that in general and why, there's a market for that, and you'll like watch a pretty terrible Christian movie and people are like, oh, that's so good. And then it's like, well, what do you mean?
Annie, Kirk Cameron is a good friend of the show. So, please keep
I didn't name anyone. So if I had to choose a movie.
Yes.
Okay. I would pick Calvary.
Fantastic movie.
Yeah. Agreed. With Brendan Gleeson by one of the McDonough brothers. It's a rough watch, I will say. So
yes.
Please don't take my naming it as an immediate recommendation. You should, some people have limitations as to what they're willing to watch and sit through.
Yeah. It's got some, hit up the parents guy because it is an R-rated film, mostly for language, but with a little bit of other stuff too. And that other stuff could kind of give away the movie. But that's a fantastic, we've watched it a couple times together. I wrote one of my papers in seminary on Calvary, which you helped me write. Okay, in like a very integrity way.
I did not write it for him.
Yeah, no. There was nothing like that. Hey, cool. Well, I hope, sweetie, I hope you're feeling a little more comfortable. And a listener, I feel like you're a little bit more comfortable now that you know who you're listening to today. So let's get into our topic. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Let's do it. All right. So the topic for us today, and I'm really glad that you mentioned Calvary and not Silence, because Silence is a movie that we're going to probably reference at least a couple times because it's very, very fitting to our topic today, which is the 26 Martyrs of Japan. Which happened in a very crucial, very pivotal time in the history of Christianity in Japan. And so let's talk about it. So for those of you guys who aren't familiar, the movie Silence was a really, really great film by Martin Scorsese, starring, who's in this, sweetheart?
Andrew Garfield. What's that one guy's name? No, it's slipping from me. The guy who plays Kylo Ren. He's in A Marriage Story.
Adam Driver.
That's right. Liam Neeson. Those are the big names there. Yeah. Right.
Yes. So we're not going to spoil it, but there's a lot of some uniting themes, and I think that's important. So we'll try not to get too much into that.
And I will say, I almost said Silence. I did. I almost said, only because it's the way that it addresses the subject matter is so, complex. There's no easy answer. It doesn't leave you with, this is how you should feel about this thing. And it makes you ask a lot of questions of yourself, which I think is one of the better marks of a film. But
yes.
If you want to watch that, also you should look some things up in there.
Very much. Yeah. That's a tough one, and we are going to kind of spoil the tough things that happen in that movie because there's a lot of crossover. So Japan is yeah, let's go back. We're going to go back to the 1500s. It's kind of where we're going to be, situating ourselves for this episode. And the 1500s is an interesting time for Europe. Christianity is kind of this dominant, powerful, impactful, culturally relevant force throughout Europe, and you've got some rival nations who are basically kind of they're kind of playing paint by numbers with the unconquered world. And so even the last episode we talked about was definitely the rough side of colonialism, which was Spain's kind of entry to the New World that also included the West Indies islands. And so you also have a lot of things happening on the other side of the Pacific in Japan and that part of Asia. And so what happens at first is we're going to see this figure by the name of Francis Xavier. And Francis Xavier is going to be, he was a Spanish-born missionary, and he is going to be known as the Apostle of the East because in 1549, he's going to land in Japan and he's going to introduce Catholicism for the first time. And at this time, I know that for many of you guys who know a little bit about the history of Japan, you're like, wow, that's really strange because I didn't think that Japan was open to Westerners. And there is going to be a big, basically iron door that's going to slam shut for Japan sealing off the rest of the world. But that's not happened just yet. At this time, they're actually very optimistic. They don't mind the religious diversity that Christianity is going to bring to their community, and they're very optimistic about it creating opportunities for trade and for basically utilizing a lot of the trade and resource relationships that the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to basically help to boost the Japanese economy. So they're seeing a lot of benefits here. This seems to be a very, very good thing. So we're going to see Spanish, I think it's Portuguese first, Portuguese missionaries, and then Spanish missionaries coming after that. And like I said, for the most part, it's a pretty positive experience. And there's about a generation of just Catholicism kind of sweeping all over Japan, not becoming a majority religion by any means, but I mean, still pretty impactful. Estimates I've read were anywhere from there were around 300,000 to even 1 million Christians throughout Japan, which is, a pretty crazy thing to think about. The big shift that we're going to see here is when a fellow by the name of Toyotomi Hideyoshi becomes the ruler of Japan, and he kind of reunites the fragmented parts of Japan that had existed before that. Now, like I said, at first he was cool with Christianity, but he was much more suspicious of it because he was concerned about the influence it was having in Japan. Because, see, these local leaders, I forget the Japanese term. I tried to use as few Japanese terms as possible in this, just because there's a lot. I think it's daimyo, something like that. But there's these small kind of like feudal lords in Japan, and what Hideyoshi is observing is that these feudal lords had converted to Christianity, but they were growing intolerant and at times openly violent towards other religions. So where they were like destroying Buddhist temples or persecuting Buddhist practitioners, or they would basically empty out a Buddhist temple and make it into a Christian place of worship. And, so he's kind of noticing, this Christianity doesn't seem to be playing super well with our more native religions. And so in 1587, he's going to enact a ban on Christianity, and he's going to try to stop all missionaries from coming from Europe, and he's going to expel the ones that were existing. And this was only mildly successful because, again, the Japanese people didn't really have a reason to have a negative stereotype of the Christians, and the Jesuits who had come to kind of be the first wave of missionary work had done a decent job. And so everything is going to shift when we get to 1596, when we get to what's called the San Felipe incident. Now, this is a really challenging story because I think there's a lot of hearsay, and it's one of those stories where it's like you never really know what quite happened unless you were there, but there's definitely some strong interpretations of what happened. So the facts are a Spanish ship full of cargo crashes on a small island outside the mainland of Japan. The Japanese authorities seize the cargo, which of course the Spanish are upset by, and they kind of get into this little altercation where you've got Spanish authorities and Japanese authorities trying to basically negotiate how to deal with this. And what happens is the captain of this ship that had crashed, and this is even where I was confused because in some reports, it sounds like he's making a vague threat. In some, it sounds like maybe this was a miscommunication. But essentially, the captain said, and this word came all the way up to our guy Hideyoshi, well, what the Spanish typically do is they send missionaries and friars to a country before the conquest. So if you have like Catholic missionaries here, you should rest assured that war will be happening afterwards. And I don't know if he was saying that to kind of flex on the Japanese to say, hey, you better let me get my cargo back. I don't know if it was said, like it got lost in translation, but this was essentially the final nail in the coffin where Hideyoshi was like, I am now convinced that the Europeans who are doing this have completely evil ulterior motives for what's happening. And the tricky part about this, and we try to be a little open in how we understand history, is that that's not a far-fetched interpretation of history, unfortunately, because Hideyoshi was looking at what he knew of the situation in the Philippines. And the Philippines was heavily colonized by the Spaniards. And while that did lead to this giant growth of Catholicism, it also led to what colonialism often brings, which is oppression of native peoples and destruction of native cultures, and just oppression and the kind of the manipulation of the resources there. Like they weren't there to make Christians and then become equal in the eyes of the law. They were there to please God and get some, tasty resources for the king. And that was kind of the law of the land back then. So, also, sweetie, feel free to jump in with any, thoughts.
I do. I have lots of thoughts. I had thoughts that, I listened to last week's podcast. I did a little research. I didn't want to look too far into what the main topic is for today.
Yeah.
But I was like looking up how frequently, colonization of a people or land came after, missionaries being sent. And I kind of figured it was pretty frequent, and it was. And I was looking at, I was trying to find examples of, that when missionaries came, right, and usually when missionaries come, right, they have full faith in the gospel and in the power of God to redeem humanity, and maybe even sometimes the value of these people are made in the image of God and their culture is, valuable in some way, versus, using military might to, squash any sort of rebellions. And I guess I almost want to say protect the missionaries, but it seems as though whenever there is a military presence, it's not just because they're like, oh, we're doing this for God. It's like, no, there's lots of other political and monetary benefits to that is sort of hidden underneath that claim.
Right.
I'm not a historian, but that's what it seems like to me. And listening to the last episode, and how how sad it was, what the native people had to go through at the hands of the Spanish conquistadors, right? You're sort of left in this moral dilemma as a believer, because you're like, yes, I do believe that God's word is good and it's good for everyone. But then also you're like, well, the church certainly has a reputation for, misusing or squashing a lot of really good and beautiful things of the culture of the native people, and then hiding much more sinister, really demonic motives that are either purposefully done by people who are only using religion as a justifier, or allow other people to do the same thing.
Well, it's interesting because you get the sense that, and I don't want to lean too much on our episode from last week for those who haven't seen it yet, or for haven't listened to it. It's challenging because when you, and you guys probably have noticed we've kind of hit, this has been like an unspoken mini series on Christian colonialism, which we'll probably explore more in detail when we actually put a little bit more effort into it. But it's interesting because you do sense a great deal of earnestness, and I think that what we as modern viewers of history can sometimes do is we strip away the earnestness and we say, no, these dudes were just a bunch of gold hungry sadists who were just using the gospel for, like, I don't think that's the case. And I do think, like, it's fascinating. I mean, like, to me, it's interesting that, like, so on record, which is very interesting, there was no record known for the Spanish or Portuguese to send troops into Japan. Now, that's not to say it never would have happened, but there's no like legal way of knowing, like, oh yeah, this was talked about at such and such council in Barcelona or whatever the case may be. And so, like, they did have missionaries there, and their purpose was to reach the lost. And so, like, I think the hard thing is they did have this genuine honest like love for others that, I mean, like clearly bears fruit, because within like a generation there's hundreds of thousands of Christians in Japan, which is super cool. The bummer is we don't know what that would have led to and how that actually could have been used to abuse the Japanese people instead of showing them care. And what we see in the stories of places like the Philippines and in places like the New World, like Mexico and throughout Latin America, is the people seems to have a great reverence for the soul of a person, but didn't know how to honor their bodies and didn't know how to honor their livelihood in a way that reflected the soul, because they would want to convert someone, but then just as easily turn them into just kind of a perpetually subordinate person. And that, I think, in our 21st century lens is like pretty despicable, and I think rightfully so. Yeah.
It reminded me I had this experience when I was in graduate school. I went to graduate school for theater, for generative dramaturgy, and we had a very prominent dramaturg come and speak to us, and he met with each of the people in my cohort, and he was like asking us, what are you interested in doing, And I said something like, I would be interested in collaborating with maybe some, Christian or faith-based theater group to help them, process and develop their plays or musicals, because I see this as a really big problem in certain, types of Christian art, that it's very reductive. And I think that a lot of the time it's not really quality art. And he looked at me and said, listen, I just need to tell you what I'm thinking of and what I'm feeling. And I was like, okay. And he said, what you said just now, and this man was not a believer, and he said, I used to go on vacation, and he said somewhere in South America, and that he loved going there because, they had all these beautiful textiles and these very cultural, like pieces of artisan materials that they would just produce and that they would sell, and it was very genuine and it was very culturally representative for them. And then he went back several years later after a lot of missionaries went there, and that they didn't do that anymore. They didn't sell any sort of artisan goods. They didn't sell any sort of culturally important, textiles or anything. And that it made him really sad, that it seemed as though it was a direct result of the church being there, that these native people stopped producing these things. And, and he said that to me, and I was just like, that's where you're going to stop? Like, and he just said, I just feel like it's really sad how whenever it feels like, you see the church or whoever religion getting involved in these other non-Western cultures, how their culture really seems to suffer.
Yeah.
And, and I was like, okay.
Yeah. And interestingly, that's kind of what makes our story for today, a little more complex than I think martyrdom tales are often kind of portrayed. Because I think that when we as Christians look at martyrdom, and don't worry, listener, I'm about to get into the story of the martyrdom, we tends to look at it like, because martyrdom is such a beautiful reflection of Christ, who gave his life up, but also in giving his life, it was almost like showing the evil forces, you can't really take anything from me. And that's kind of the rallying cry of martyrs throughout the centuries and across the globe, is that you can't take anything from me, because everything that I've been given is from Christ himself. So you can't take my life, and even my blood that's spilled will actually be a testimony. So you're actually doing me a solid. And so we paint these beautiful tales of martyrdom, but at the same time, we have to, I think, kind of explore the complexities, because what you're talking about with Latin America, I mean, you've got to think of the pressure on this Japanese ruler's mind, where he's like, I don't want to prime my people to be invaded and have everything about us erased and killed and people turned into serfs and slaves. And, you know, I'm not saying that he was justified in doing what he was doing, but he was, I think, backed into a corner by a really violent historical precedent. And so, like I said, after the San Felipe incident, which happens in 1596, he gets word that, oh yeah, well, Spain does send missionaries before they send the warships, and that's when he's like, all right, this is it. But the problem is, like we mentioned earlier, he doesn't want to sever his ties with Portugal and Spain because they had become very profitable trade partners, and they don't want to lose that. But he does want to put an end to Christianity in his country. And so he does something very, very targeted towards not the Europeans, but towards the Christians themselves. And so he stages a mass execution that will happen. And so what he does is he's going to round up all of the religious men that he can find in Kyoto and Osaka, which will total about 24 people, 4 of whom would be Spanish missionaries, 1 from Portugal, 1 from Mexico. Hey, shout out Mexico. And then three Japanese Jesuits, and then 15 Japanese lay people. After their arrest, they're going to have their ears partially severed and loaded into ox carts, where they would be paraded around several cities to kind of make a spectacle of them as a warning to other Christians, basically to recant their faith. Then after several days of kind of just being paraded around and made a spectacle of, they were forced to walk all the way to Nagasaki, which was a 27-day trip. I forget how many miles, but it was something like 900 miles on foot. They were sent to Nagasaki because that was the center of Christianity in Japan. Also, it was mid-January, and so they had to deal with the harsh winter climate, all while walking on foot, carrying open wounds. Along the way, 2 more Japanese Catholic laymen are actually added to the group. There's not a whole lot of clarity about why that was. Some think that they were just kind of violently added, but they cooperated. So when they arrived at this place in Nagasaki, actually I read this story, I didn't put it in my notes, but I'm going to try and recall it from memory. They were, the night before they arrived in Nagasaki, they were in this really small fishing town, and it was in such close proximity to Nagasaki that the Japanese guards who were marching them along were concerned that if all of the Christians in this town saw that these men were about to be martyred, that during the night there was going to be some kind of revolt, or maybe the Christians would band together and try to rescue them or something. And that didn't happen, but what did happen was that as the men awoke and started their last stretch into Nagasaki, where they would be martyred, the streets were just lined with Christians. Just all of these families and all of these people just silently sitting and just watching these men walk by, just looking completely battered and bleeding and, feet swollen and whatnot. And so they arrive at the place of their execution, 26 men, and there were only 24 crosses for the original group. And so one of the men leading the execution offered the youngest of the people there, who was a 14-year-old boy, and he said, listen, we don't have enough crosses for this, and we don't want to, kind of throw a monkey wrench in this. So if you're willing to just say that you're not a Christian anymore, and if you're willing to recant your faith, you have your life today. You can live your life and not have to go through this. And the young boy was like, no, I don't want to do that. And he declined, and he climbed on top of his cross. And the 26 men were all killed in a mass crucifixion that ended in each of them being impaled through the heart with a spear. One of these Christians is now known as St. Paul Miki. And he was a Japanese man born into the Catholic faith, and he was also a leader of his community. It's recorded that throughout their long trek to Nagasaki, he was actually preaching sermons and just giving messages of encouragement. Also, the people were singing hymns and chanting prayers as they were walking. And there is a quote that is attributed to him that people believe was from his final sermon, which he actually preached on the cross as he was being crucified. And let me read it for us real quick. The sentence of judgment says these men came to Japan from the Philippines, but I did not come from any other country. I am a true Japanese man. The only reason for my being killed is that I have taught the doctrine of Christ. I certainly did teach the doctrine of Christ, and I thank God it is for this reason that I die. I believe that I am telling only the truth before I die. I know you believe me, and I want to say to you all once again, ask Christ to help you to become happy. I obey Christ. After Christ's example, I forgive my persecutors. I do not hate them. I ask God to have pity on all, and I hope my blood will fall on my fellow men as a fruitful rain. And that's the story of the 26 martyrs of Japan. Sweetie, how you feeling?
I didn't look any of this up.
Yeah.
That's just really heartbreaking. Right, like, yeah. For anybody to have to go through that, right, is really heartbreaking. And for them to go through this and to spend all that time marching, right, they had plenty of time to turn around, and they were devoted to their faith. And, you know, I think God was honored by their devotion and their sacrifice. And, yeah, I think that's why this topic feels, to me, really complex, right? Because, yes, the church has historically played a part in colonization, forceful and violent colonization, and then you have situations like this where, you know, these men were very earnest, and they were challenged in a way that, you know, really kind of put their faith to the test, and they, you know, remain faithful to the end. And I think that's just hard. But at the same time, like you were saying, that's what makes the story of the martyrs so meaningful, is because they were choosing to value the life that they would receive with Jesus as more important than the life that they had now.
Right.
And what a testament to say that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's really easy to look at the decision to do this to them as really evil, but then you look at all these other instances of, you know, the Spanish and these other countries using the church as a way to have a foothold in, you know, these new areas. And that's more heartbreaking too, but in a completely different way, because it doesn't seem very redeeming.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about this with after last week, you know, just how contrary it is, right, to come and say you're going to spread the good news, but to come with an army. You know, Jesus didn't do that. He could have, right? He could have come with his army of angels, and he didn't do that. He became incarnate with, I mean, literally the culture, right? The Jewish people incarnate in human flesh, and he came in humility, and that just really puts it in contrast with some of the other stories we've heard.
Yeah, it's hard because it seems like the roots of what European Christians did when they found new places to populate, they were so deep, like it didn't seem like there was a strong plan. Because honestly, like when you look at what had happened in Japan in just this few decades, not only did they bring the gospel, they established like there was a Jesuit order present there, so there were priests, there were clergy, there were churches and people supporting each other and communities. So they had done that, which is beautiful, but also they had established really good trade options for the Japanese. They had, I think I read somewhere that because of Portugal's influence, they were now able to trade in Chinese silk, which was a high commodity back at that time period. Yeah. So like, they had brought such a blessing to this country already. But the question, I think that a great question that we have just kind of hanging over us is how long was that going to last before Spain just tried to make Japan another colony? And who knows, maybe the trade, the benefits of having a trade partner outweighed that. But you think like, this is all it takes, you know, like you take people, you integrate them into a foreign land, and then you try to make their lives better. You make them partners. You grow in commerce together. It's the whole thing that David Livingstone did when he went to, what would be called Rhodesia. And he's definitely a missionary. We'll do an episode on one day. Like, you come and you try to work for the general well-being of the people. And if you come with government backing, then you come with a lot of resources to do good. But if you're thinking in terms of this like grand kind of empire lens, then yeah, I mean, and I think that is kind of the deep heartbreak of this story, is that we find the Japanese leaders or rulers' concerns to be so relatable, because we've read the stories of what happens when these European nations go unchecked and just abuse a country that doesn't have the firepower to defend themselves.
Yeah. I had a question. What was the effect then after this? Did the persecution continue? Was this just kind of like the big one and then it stopped just to send a message? Like, how frequent was this kind of, intentional, rooting out of Western influences in Japan?
This was definitely the biggest. And I probably shouldn't say that. This was the most kind of monumental, I think, because of the scope, but also because of the spectacle. And like, again, we'll reference the movie Silence, which we didn't really give a good synopsis of it, but Silence is a film about film based on a book written by a Japanese Catholic man in the 20th century, where he tells a fictional story, I think it's fictional, about two Portuguese missionaries who go to Japan while Christianity is being heavily persecuted in Japan, to find one of their priest friends who they've heard rumors has given up the faith.
They were Jesuit priests?
I think they were Jesuits, yeah. And it's a fantastic movie. It's a very thought-provoking. It's a good story. But one of the tactics that the Japanese use, I mean, the ruler who's in charge of hurting the Christians is literally called the Inquisitor, which is kind of a cruel twist of irony there. But they go above and beyond to do, like, it's spectacle. Like, it's something that you look at and you're like, that is so like just cruel to my barest sensibilities as a human being, that you're like, oh my gosh, I don't ever want to do anything that leads to something like that. And that's what the Japanese did. And so basically the church would be driven underground, and there's this really interesting kind of beautiful legacy of Christians. They're called the Kakure Kurishitans, which I love that Kurishitan is just Christian, but kind of like Japaneseized a little bit, like that's even how it's written out. But these were Christians who went underground in Japan for nearly 300 years, because the ban on Christianity wasn't lifted until 1873. And they found ways to continue to worship in the Christian faith, but that were heavily masked by Buddhist and Shinto imagery and practices. Like, I read that one thing they would do is when they would do like the chants that were, or when they would pray in a way that was almost indistinguishable from the Buddhist chants, but they were actually praying to God, or even praying to the Virgin Mary, but it was stylized as a Buddhist chant. So unless you were looking for it, you wouldn't know. Another thing I read was crazy. They used what's called the Maria canon, which so in Buddhism, one of their goddesses that's very highly revered is named Canon, and she is a motherly figure, and she is considered the goddess of mercy. And so what Japanese Catholics would do is they would get these statues of Canon and they would consider it Mary instead of the deity represented in Buddhism. And the really cool thing about that is that since Canon was also seen as the goddess of child rearing, often she would have a baby in her arms, which all the Christians would look at and say, yeah, this is the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. And that wouldn't arouse much suspicion, because to any onlooker they would say, oh, this person's just a good Buddhist. But in their mind and in their heart, they were following Christ, and they would hide little wooden crosses. And an interesting thing about the movie, if you watch, this is like a movie review, is that the emphasis on imagery in that movie, like these Christians have been so detached from the hierarchy of the church that having a priest there who can like lead a mass is this huge deal. But I mean, you see that historically, like these Christians were very dependent on these like little bits of imagery, because you think like there's no seminaries for these guys. They don't have a direct line to Rome unless someone is getting smuggled in. So basically for 300 years, these Christians are kind of just supporting themselves, very detached from the whole world of Christianity around them, and that had to be extremely challenging.
Yeah, and what literature did they have available, and for how long until they got caught?
Right.
And it got confiscated, and it's not like, people were sending, I mean, maybe they were, airdropping Bibles, in villages and stuff.
Unlikely, yeah, especially in before the 1800s, Yeah. So, but Christianity continued to have a legacy, and I think would kind of grow again when the ban was lifted, and then we would see thousands and thousands of Japanese in the town of Nagasaki, leading to one of our favorite episodes ever from Takashi Nagai, who was kind of a very different kind of martyr, right? But yeah, so kind of a complex story. Still, I think a very beautiful one. I do think that the way that Christians look at martyrdom stories is a beautiful reflection of what our faith really is. It is kind of this celebration that like the most horrible powers around us that are not godly can't really take anything from us. We can freely give what we have because
on loan.
Yeah, exactly, because it won't be taken eternally. We've still been promised life everlasting, our bodies being glorified. Like we can shed our blood for today, but it won't last. Like there was a story which came out of, I think, some like Catholic publication, so I guess I'll like a little bit of a grain of salt, but when they were cutting these martyrs' ears, which is such a cruel thing, but they were bloodletting them basically so they would get more exhausted on their long journey. One of the 14-year-olds was like mocking them as they were like cutting the Christians' ears, and he's like, yeah, like you're shedding the blood of Christians. Like, don't you realize, like you're bamboozling yourself. Like you're doing something that you don't realize is actually very beautiful for the glory of God. And we're not mad at that. So
right. Yeah, which is very much what's the word? Right, when we read the Passion story, you know, Jesus going to Calvary and all the wounds that he bore. And now we have the benefit of the perspective of him being resurrected, right? And that's sort of what these young boys are doing, right? As they're seeing them inflict pain on Christians, is just the benefit of, I know what happens.
Right.
You know, on the third day, Jesus is resurrected, and we'll have that someday too. Yeah. Isn't this event, the 26 Martyrs, doesn't it happen at the beginning of the movie? Like at the very, very beginning?
Oh, it might. Yeah. I think it does. I think there is a big crucifixion scene at the beginning. Yeah. Which would be very, very, you know, on color, because it kind of fits the theme of the film, and it starts that big period of persecution in Japan, which is a bummer. So, yeah. Well, sweetheart, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
He asked me, what, was it last night?
Yeah, it was yesterday.
Yeah. And I don't know. I was not having a great day. And he was like, Annie, I have a question to ask you. And you know, when people say, hey, I need to talk to you, you're like, oh no, what is it?
Yeah.
And he asked me, do you want to be a guest? Do you want to co-host tomorrow? And I was like, are you for real? Are you messing with me right now? And he was like, yeah, he was on one knee too. And I was like, this is so sweet.
I hammed it up a little bit.
You did.
Yeah, but I figured you would appreciate that. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, sweetie, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having. I love you too. Thanks for having me.
All right, and I love you too, listener, but like way less. This is my wife, you know. But thanks for being here, guys. Hope you enjoy it. Follow us on our Instagram page. I don't know, leave us a review, 5-star us on Spotify. You don't have to send us any money. We don't have a Patreon yet, but hey, we just appreciate you being here. Just appreciate you listening. Thanks for letting us chat, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.